Hello and welcome to our webinar, Diagnosis, Evaluation, and Treatment of ADHD under the BASC-3 model of assessment and intervention. We are pleased to have Dr. Cecil Reynolds, co-author of the BASC family of products, with us today presenting. We also have Aaron Gunnelson, our Pearson product manager, and Chris Uzenik, our Pearson senior educational consultant, with us today, and they will monitor the chat box for Dr. Reynolds during the webinar. This webinar is being presented in broadcast audio. Please turn up your computer speakers to hear the audio. There are no phone-in options. If you're having any connectivity or audio issues, please click on the question mark at the top right-hand side of your computer screen for assistance. Please type any questions that you have in the chat box. We will answer them live, time permitting, or we will follow up with a personal email after the webinar has concluded. You will be able to download the CE forms that you need from this webinar under Event Resources. This recording will be available 1/2 hour after the webinar concludes using your webinar login from today, and the handout will be sent to you later today via personal email. With all that being said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Reynolds.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that introduction. I appreciate everybody joining with me today. We're set to go for about 90 minutes. This is a very content-heavy talk, so I'm going to be moving along pretty quickly. But just remember that you will be getting all of these slides in a PDF handout, so you can go back and review things if I happen to cover some of them a little too quickly. We may or may not take a short 5-minute break in the middle of this. We'll kind of see how the timing is going. So with that, I'm going to move ahead. And just to remind you, although Sherry was nice enough to mention it, I am the author of the BASC-3, and that's the assessment scale and the intervention materials that I'll be emphasizing today. And while I'll try to be as objective as I can and be accurate in my discussions of them, remember, the BASC-3 is my baby. And what you know is that everybody thinks their baby's pretty. And I'm no exception. So I think the BASC-3 is pretty, and I'm going to say nice things about it. But you should make your own independent decision about your choice of diagnostic and related techniques. So the first order of business in talking about ADHD is to answer this fundamental question that continues to be debated, even in some professional circles. There are folks on listservs and Facebook pages who, anytime ADHD is mentioned, want to argue that ADHD is a made-up disorder, that Big Pharma in particular is responsible for ADHD and that it's not real. So let's examine that. In 1865, a German physician, Heinrich Hoffmann, wrote the story of a young man that he called Fidgety Phil. This remains a very good description of children with ADHD, though he didn't name it. It's actually a story he wrote in poetic form about the son of a family with whom he had dinner. And it describes Fidgety Phil's behavior throughout this formal sit-down dinner with his parents and friends. And it's such a wonderful description. Anyone who has an ADHD child will relate to this 1865 description. And you can find this later on the web and actually read the English translation of Fidgety Phil, or if you speak German, you can read it there. It was not until 1902 that Dr. Still and Treadgold, who were pediatricians, described 43 children in their clinical practice in a peer-reviewed journal, children who had serious problems with sustained attention and impulse control. And they indicated that the boy-girl ratio was about 3-to-1, which is about what it is now. That's been pretty constant. Before we emphasized the attentional component as much, it was boy to girl 4-to-1. But since girls seem to display the attentional issues more profoundly than boys, and that has been recognized. The ratio has dropped, but it's still about 3 to 1 a male disorder. Doctors still believe that ADHD was a disorder of moral development. And that's a notion that remained with us until clearly into the late 1950s. And some people continue to believe that ADHD is simply a moral disorder. That is, it's a disorder of character or parenting and simple discipline, and not really an underlying brain disturbance. But the concept of ADHD has been with us in the literature now for over 150 years, if we go back to Heinrich Hoffmann. The fact is that ADHD is a neurobiological disorder, and I present this as fact, not opinion. There are many myths surrounding it. Many of these myths indicate that children are hyperactive because their parents just don't make them behave. That teachers just want children medicated so they do not have to do their job. That hyperactivity is nothing but boys being boys. ADHD was created by physicians and drug companies to increase their business and make money. Children and adolescents use ADHD as an excuse not to do work at school. And of course, occasionally some do. Children and adolescents do not have ADHD. They're just lazy. Another myth. Parents just want to say their children have ADHD so they can get accommodations at school. And this isn't fair to the other children. And certainly anyone abuses any category of disability to get services. But there are clearly children with ADHD. ADHD is only for children is another myth. Adults who say they have ADHD are just lazy. Not true. Adults use ADHD as an excuse for mistakes made at work and in relationships. And certainly ADHD can impair you vocationally or educationally or in social settings and in relationships. But it's not an excuse. Sometimes folks will take advantage of that and make an excuse, but that doesn't mean that they don't have ADHD. In fact, ADHD can be a lifelong disorder. And the data that I read indicate to me that ADHD extends over the lifespan into about a third, a third, and a third. And what I mean by that is that about 1 out of 3 persons with ADHD will see their ADHD resolve shortly after puberty. Another third will see their ADHD resolve around the ages between 22 and 26. But for those where it hasn't resolved by about 26, it's going to be a lifelong disorder. And it's about a third, a third, a third. Well, what explains that? Well, the time around puberty is a time of rapid neurobiological development of the brain. And again, between the ages of 22 and 26 is when the final development of the frontal lobes occurs, particularly the prefrontal regions, which are implicated in ADHD. So it makes great sense that these would be times when the underlying neurobiology would improve. But for about a third of child diagnoses, ADHD is a lifelong disorder. ADHD is real. It's a brain disorder. It's a disorder of self-regulation due to hypoactivity of key communication circuitry in and between the frontal regions of the brain and the limbic and posterior portions of the brain. These are key dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline pathways. And those are the neurotransmitters that are primarily implicated in ADHD. And that also explains what was thought of for decades as the paradoxical effect of stimulants and other sympathomimetics in the treatment of ADHD. People thought, why in the world would a stimulant cause a person with ADHD to slow down or pay better attention, to be less distractible? And the answer is that the stimulants increased the metabolic arousal of these areas that are under-aroused in their normal state for persons with ADHD. It brings their arousal level metabolically up to normal so that these parts of their brain can do the job they were designed to do. It's associated with hypodensity of the prefrontal region on average in ADHD individuals. Not every ADHD individual, but on average, they have less density in the prefrontal region. We have characterized it in our book on ADHD as like having a Ferrari brain with bicycle brakes. It also, though, need not be limiting. And ADHD can be managed effectively at all ages throughout the lifespan. ADHD can be managed. It's not cured by treatment and intervention. It's cured in the cases I discussed earlier by maturation. But it can be managed very effectively. In the year 2000, which is longer ago than I want to think about now, the American Academy on Pediatrics released a report on diagnosis of ADHD. And they noted then that ADHD is a common problem and becoming an increasingly controversial one. And they recommended that pediatricians who were diagnosing ADHD engage in broad diagnostic work that is largely behaviorally based. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommended that pediatricians engage in the assessment of ADHD that would include information obtained directly from parents or caregivers, as well as a classroom teacher or other school professional. And that's entirely appropriate, as you know, because that's where children spend structured time. Regarding the core symptoms of ADHD in various settings, the age of onset, the duration of symptoms, and degree of functional impairment. That's great advice, by the way. And they also said that the evaluation of a child with ADHD should include assessment for coexisting conditions. And the ones they listed were learning and language problems, aggression, disruptive behavior, depression, or anxiety. They estimated in 2000 that as many as 1 out of 3 children diagnosed with ADHD had a coexisting or comorbid condition. We know now that that was an underestimate. It's about 50% have a comorbid disorder of some kind. For example, we see obsessive compulsive symptoms overrepresented in ADHD. We see even conduct disorder. We see a lot of other things that coexist with ADHD. Broadband assessment is necessary for accurate diagnosis. And if you go back and look at what they recommend, clearly they are recommending broad-based assessment for accurate diagnosis. This is critical. They recognize the need, as we do, and as others have noted historically, that you have to engage in a broad-based assessment of the behavior and affect of children suspected of ADHD. And why is this important? Well, there are simply way too many mimics. There are things that can look like ADHD and aren't. And if you don't assess for those, for example, anxiety is a wonderful example. Children, particularly boys who have an anxiety disorder or suffer from depression under the age of about 12 will show a lot of symptoms of ADHD. They will have attentional issues. They will be irritable. They will be fidgety. and can often be diagnosed as ADHD if you only use a narrow band ADHD scale that doesn't allow you to assess or rule out these other factors. But it's important in all disorders. There are simply too many mimics. Narrow band scales tend to overdiagnose whatever's in the name of the scale because that's what it focuses on. Mimics are common. Comorbidities are common, and behaviors may be specific to a single setting. If children only show symptoms of ADHD in one classroom at school with a particular teacher, that's not ADHD. If it's only one particular community setting, it's not ADHD. It's critical to triangulate, as are data from a clinical interview. Pervasiveness of the presentation is important to diagnosis and to intervention. ADHD isn't something that it just exists at one time of day in one place. Secondary and other comorbidities should also influence choices and sequences of treatment. If a child does have ADHD and depression, we may not want to treat both at the same time. Sometimes doing that can be counterproductive. We also may not have access to the resources to do both simultaneously. So we can evaluate which is having the greatest adverse effect on the child's life and treat that first. And I can say that I have seen children that I've personally diagnosed with both ADHD and depression and recommended their depression be treated before we looked at their ADHD interventions. And I have certainly encountered cases where once the depression resolved, the ADHD resolved, which told me I was probably wrong, that it was depression and not depression and ADHD. So these are certainly serious considerations in getting the diagnosis right. And we have to look broadly at children. But these are good ideas, not just for ADHD, but for other diagnoses. And the criteria for categorization of a student as emotionally disturbed under IDEIA also requires that we look broadly at children, the context of their behavior and its acuteness and chronicity and its history. Emotional disturbance under the federal law means a condition exhibiting one or more of the following over a long period of time and to a marked degree that adversely affects the child's educational performance. So the type of assessment I'm recommending applies really to all areas of emotional disturbance. An inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors, an inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. Certainly a lot of this fits ADHD too, by the way. Inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances, and certainly ADHD presents inappropriate behavior under what are quite normal circumstances. A general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, common comorbidities, a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems, and the definition tells us the term also includes schizophrenia. And it does not apply to maladjusted unless it is determined they also have. All of the school psychs in my audience have that memorized. I'm not going through that for you, but we have quite a divergent audience today. So these are all things that require broad-based assessment to determine whether or not a child is eligible for services at schools. Because we know that DSM-5 diagnoses do not automatically make you eligible for special education services. There must be adverse educational impact. So we have to consider that as well. So let's see what the DSM-5 tells us specifically about diagnosing ADHD. And I apologize, I'm occasionally going to have a little sip of water over here because I'm trying to talk a little more quickly than usual because we have so much to cover. And people sometimes ask me why I don't just talk faster. And I was born and grew up in North Carolina, but I've been living in Texas for almost 40 years, and this is about fast as I can talk. So, but we'll get through it. So the DSM-5 tells us that ADHD is a persistent pattern of inattention and/or hyperactivity that interferes with functioning or development. And that's important. It must interfere with functioning or development. That's characterized by inattention, and it says that 6 or more of the following symptoms have persisted for at least 6 months to a degree that is inconsistent with developmental level. And that's new, by the way. They used to ignore developmental level in that, and that negatively impacts directly on social and academic or occupational activities. They then give us 9 classes of inattentive activity. And I want to emphasize that those are examples. It is not an exhaustive list of every way that a child who is inattentive can show you that they are inattentive. And/or hyperactivity and impulsivity. And once again, it's 6 or more of the following symptoms have persisted for at least 6 months, again, so it has to be chronic, a marked period of time, to a degree that's inconsistent with developmental level. Again, consideration of developmental level is new to DSM-5 and something we argued for decades before it found its way in there. And again, that has a negative impact on social and academic or occupational activities. So the inattention examples they give are things like fails to give attention to details, makes careless mistakes, difficulty sustaining attention, does not seem to listen when spoken to directly, does not follow through on instructions, difficulty organizing tasks, losing things, being forgetful in everyday tasks, and being easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. So you can see that these are really good and very common examples. But again, this is not an exhaustive list. Children can show you inattention in other ways. But these are simply some of the most common examples. So don't feel like if it's not on this list, it's not a symptom of inattention. That's not true. Hyperactivity and impulsivity, they also give us examples that kids fidget and squirm often, fidgety Phil, right? They leave their seat when being seated is expected, run about or climb on things, unable to play or be in leisure activities quietly, talk excessively, and they particularly interrupt others, on the go, or act as if driven by a motor. And I can't tell you how many parents have said that very phrase to me in an interview had ADHD. They will say, he acts like he's driven by a motor. Difficulty waiting turns and intruding on others. Individuals with ADHD expend a great deal of energy not to talk and not to interrupt and not to jump in and intrude. And most times, if they're not in an active intervention, they fail. But it consumes a lot of energy not to behave. It takes a lot more energy for a person with ADHD than it does for an ordinary person. There are criteria in DSM-5 for diagnosing ADHD. At least 2 or impulsivity must present prior to the age of 12. And new age cutoff. That's age cutoff in DSM-5. They've raised the age of first presentation, and 12 is a for that. At least two symptoms are present in more than one setting. So again, it has to be more pervasive than just in one place at one time in the presence of one person. Clear evidence that the symptoms interfere with social, academic, or occupational functioning. So to get a diagnosis of ADHD, there must be functional impairment. And that's a term I'll come back to. Helping BASC-3, clear emphasis on functional impairment. I'll talk a little bit later. The symptoms do not better explained by another mental disorder, such as anxiety, a mood disorder, substance abuse. So for example, if a kid is taking Benadryl and they have an adverse reaction to it, they can look for the world like they have ADHD. It can also be in response to certain steroids, as well as nasal decongestants, which are sympathomimetics. And one of the side effects of sympathomimetics is being jittery, irritable, and squirmy. So be sure you know from the history that it's not a medication side effect that you're looking at. But of course, if it is, it probably would not have been going on for 6 months or more. Common associated features of ADHD that we're told about would include mild delays in learning, language, social, and motor development. And in fact, the motor development issue, it's turning out, is even more profound than we thought. While not easy to observe, there's quite a bit of literature now that demonstrates that you can measure with precision with certain monitors, some of which now can be downloaded onto iPhones and watches, gait disturbances in persons with ADHD. They're so subtle that you can't see them. But these monitors detect these gait disturbances in children with ADHD and allow adequate diagnostic discrimination, for example. They're not yet approved and on the market for that, but there's a great deal of research emerging now on such matters. Work performance is impaired, and of course, for children, that's school. Poor performance on tests of attention, memory, and executive function. And we know, since ADHD is a disorder of self-regulation, that executive function will almost always be impaired in a person with ADHD. And ADHD is one of the very few true disorders of executive function. When comorbid with a mood disorder, conduct disorder, or substance use disorder, you should note that suicide risk is elevated in adolescents and young adults. It does not appear to be elevated in younger children and mature adults over about the age of 35. But in teenagers and young adults, when comorbid with a mood disorder, conduct disorder, or substance use disorder, there is a higher incidence of suicide. So now let's move to the BASC-3. We're educated about ADHD, not as much as we will be a little later. But let me just remind you about the BASC-3. The original BASC model, which I know you're all familiar with, because I'm sure you've all read the manual in great detail. I know I keep it on my bedside table. Notes that the BASC is a multidimensional, multi-method approach to assessing child and adolescent emotional and behavioral disorders. The original BASC model also applies to the BASC-2 and BASC-3. And you'll see that we have multiple dimensions. The first dimension at the base, and it's at the base for a reason, holds up everything else we do, and that is history. The term in and context to that. We have to understand the history and the context of life if we're going to diagnosis or classification correct. On BASC-3, we have the structured developmental history, which parents with an 8th grade education or higher can typically complete on their own, but you should always review it with the question. If you don't like the structured developmental history, although that's unimaginable to me, some kind of history form. When you histories, use a cheat sheet. It's too easy to forget to ask if you're in front of you. So use something structured. The next dimension is behavior. And behavior is heavily emphasized in all BASC models, and it's the first word in the name, the behavioral assessment system for children. For this, we have omnibus rating scales separately for parents and teachers. Array of behavior. So have the student observation scale. Take into the classroom and use directly to observe children, and it's old school behavioral assessment. Time and you count. We're not counting all scales, be it the BASC-3 or another, such as the Akaba, or perhaps one of our other competitors, are all impressionistic. We're asking raters to tell us if a child does something, never, sometimes, often, or almost always, or some similar rubric. That sounds on first blush like it's just too subjective, and people would interpret that all so differently that it couldn't possibly be reliable. Fortunately, we have good research starting in the 1960s that says, oh, yes, it is. Not only do raters do this reliably, but the ratings discriminate at very high levels among diagnostic groups and between diagnostic groups and normally behaving children. So that's really good news. It works. That saves us an enormous amount of time and effort, as well as enhancing the objectivity of our diagnoses. Then the next dimension is emotions and self-perceptions. Here we have a self-reported personality where the child, adolescent, or even young college student can report on how they think and feel about themselves and the world around them. So the BASC-3 is truly multidimensional, and it's multi-method. Clinical histories, behavior ratings, direct observation, personal impressions, all are captured by the core of the BASC-3. So the diagnostic components, just to remind you, are the structured developmental history. All of these forms, by the way, except the teacher rating scale, are available in English and Spanish. The student observation system for all ages, and this can be used in any setting that has educational goals. The self-reported personality, for which we have 4 versions: the SRP interview for 6 and 7, the SRP child for 8 to 11, adolescent for 12 to 21, and college for 18 to 25. And just as a quick reminder, the 19, 20, and 21-year-olds for the SRP-A are all still in school. That normative sample is not a random sample at ages 19, 20, and 21 of the population at large. It is a random sample of 19, 20, and 21-year-olds who are still in school. The SRP-I, C, and the SRP-A up through age 18 are a population proportionate stratified random sample of children in the United States, but not 19, 20, and 21. The same is true of the rating scale data. The parent rating scales break out ages 2 to 5, 6 to 11, and 12 to 21. Same caveat for ages 19, 20, and 21. And the teacher rating scales parallel this same age ranges, and we have the same caveat for the 19, 20, and 21-year-olds. We also added a parenting relationship questionnaire to BASC-2 and revised it again for BASC-3. This is for ages 2 through 18, and that's the age of the child, not the parent, just so you don't get confused about that. This tells us a great deal about the parent's understanding and perception of their relationship with their child in key dimensions, such as parental involvement, attachment. It tells us about the parenting disciplinary practices, their communication with their child both ways, how well they believe they communicate with their child and how their child communicates with them, among others. We have a scale called relational frustration that is also particularly informative if you're going to be developing interventions. So, as you know, BASC-3, if you're familiar with it, and if you're a newbie to BASC-3, then this will be even better information for you. The BASC-3 offers multiple norms. It offers same-sex norms tables. That is, you can look up scores comparing boys to boys and girls to girls, or combined gender norms tables. We also have special norms just for ADHD and general clinical norms, and these are all presented by age level. So which norms should you use? Well, first, what are norms? Norms are commonly misunderstood and misapplied. They're simply reference groups, and I really wish we'd rename them that. In our official nomenclature, standardization sample, I think, is an even worse characterization. They're really a reference group. We take a raw score from some scale, and we reference that score to the scores of some other group. And depending upon which group we refer that score to, it answers different questions for us. Different reference groups simply answer different questions, and I'll come back to that. So the general national norms would answer a question like this. Does Rob have problems with depression relative to other children his age? The sex-based norms would answer a question like hyperactivity compared to the girl. The clinical norms, how severe autism in comparison to other children diagnosed with mental health disorders of childhood. The ADHD norms can answer like this. How severe are Kent's symptoms of depression in comparison to other children diagnosed as ADHD? So different reference groups answer different questions. And more than one is often quite not to initial diagnosis where we recommend, but particularly to designing interventions and knowing where you want to start. So we need norms because of the scaling we're stuck with in psychology and education. We have interval scaling. We don't have ratio scaling. We have interval, nominal, and ordinal. We typically use interval scaling for things like interval scales. And it's a matter of relativity. Know on an interval scale where the beginning is or where the end is. The only score point we can locate accurately with interval scaling is the middle. And then we measure from the middle outward towards the two ends. If we had a ratio scale, we know where 0 is. We know where it begins. But we don't have that. We don't know. We don't know where an activity level begins. But we can find the midpoint and measure out another set of scores to compare that to. So it's a matter of relativity and a matter of frequency. And in assessment, ultimately, it's a matter of normality. It's like using that term. So there are gender differences that are common, measures of behavior, and these really abound across age and report. They'll self-reports and behavioral observations. So why do Randy and I recommend using the general heterogender norms, if you will, as opposed to homogeneous gender norms for these? First, let's look at these differences very quickly. I'm going to do this as quickly as I can, because you all know that boys, if we look at these scales, as you go across here, things you up in such a way that if the scores, if the line is above that center black line at 0, it means that higher scores. If line, it means that boys are earning higher scores. So you'll see that guys own things like hypoactivity problems generally, and at school age and in adolescence, and be anxious. We've seen a reversal toward depression. It used to be that more boys were depressed. Now it's the other way around. Girls do have more somatization disorders, which fits the anxiety profile, and more internalizing. But guys, for example, own attention problems and learning problems. Guys have more issues, have more behavioral symptoms overall. If we look at the content scales, we see a similar pattern. Girls are more adaptive, social skills, more leadership skills, study better, and communicate better. I'm sure, more problems. We have a higher disorders. Our emotional self-control is not as good, particularly when we're younger. And we have more problems with executive functioning, negative emotionality, and less resiliency. Big differences, actually. If we look at the actuarial clinical probability indexes, we see that across the board, we're likely to have clinical problems, to be functionally impaired, far more likely to have ADHD, to be emotionally disturbed in general, and more likely to be on the autism. We see a very similar pattern with parent rating. So you can look at these specifically later. But the pattern across and teacher ratings. Is then that if we were to change to homogeneous gender norms, females on all of the jagged lines would flatline. Those scores that I showed you are based on norms. So what should we use? Does it reflect reality? If we want to equate males and females on all gender norms, you have to ask, does this reflect reality? Are boys and girls really different in how they think, feel, and behave? I think they are very different. And therefore, I want to preserve those differences. If you believe that boys and girls really are different, then use norms to preserve these differences. And this is a little counterintuitive. Girls are not different in their behavior and how they feel. and how they think, and you believe these differences are artifacts of measurement bias, you can eliminate all of that measurement bias simply by using homogeneous gender norms to remove all observed differences, thereby equating boys and girls on all variables. What happens when we equate boys and girls? Well, then instead of girls with high anxiety being diagnosed with anxiety disorders, we would normalize anxiety among girls because they, as a group, have higher scores. And girls with anxiety disorders would not get treated nearly as often as they are now. Is that a good thing? I don't think so. Boys and externalizing disorders. Boys have more aggression, they're more hyperactive, and have far more attention problems. If we use boy-only norms to assess that, we will ignore a lot of boys who have attention problems that have risen to the level where it impairs their ability to function, and we would not treat. Boys and girls are not adversely affected by a common set of symptoms of inattention, for example. It turns out that at a certain level of inattention, boys and girls are adversely affected, and therefore we should not equate boys and girls on all of these variables to eliminate the fact that there's disproportionate diagnosis of anxiety disorders and disproportionate diagnosis of attentional disorders among boys. Because the reality is that there are more girls with anxiety problems, and they need to be identified. And there are more boys with ADHD, and they need to be identified. And we can document why now with looking at the neurobiology of these disorders. What if judges used homogeneous gender norms for sentencing? I don't have time to go into great detail. Just give you an example. True that approximately 98% of the armed robberies in the United States are committed by men as opposed to women. So if we were to use gender norms for sentencing in that, when a male who had committed an armed robbery came before a judge, his lawyer could argue, Your Honor, he's a guy, and guys commit almost all the armed robberies in the United States. Common, he's not that bad a guy. Give him a break, right? And so maybe the judge gives him probation first time around. And a woman comes in who's committed an armed robbery, and the prosecutor for the state gets up and says, Your Honor, only 2 to 3% of armed robberies are committed by women. Therefore, this woman must be especially evil and deserves far greater punishment than a guy who commits the same act. Lots of guys commit robbery, and the judge gives her 20 years. So we would immediately see how ludicrous that was. But by equating boys and girls on behavior rating scales and believing that we should equate how they think, feel, and behave to eliminate any differences in different diagnostic groups is equally unrealistic and will deny treatment. The use of homogeneous gender norms will deny identification and treatment of disorders across gender groups with higher prevalence rates and yield unnecessary diagnoses and treatment on those with lower prevalence rates. We want to get it right. When we are able to offer help, we want to offer the right kind of help to the right people. I'm pretty sure this is not what Timmy meant when he told Lassie it helped. So just to document that very quickly, let's look at diagnostic accuracy curves. Let's look at receiver operating characteristic curves for ADHD using both homogeneous and combined gender norms. And I don't have a pointer on this particular webinar format. So I'll just call your attention to these. If you look at the solid lines, the solid color lines here, those are the lines that depict the accuracy curves, combined gender norms. The dotted or dashed lines look at the accuracy. That in every case, if you look at the lines that are the same color, that the full line is superior in diagnostic accuracy to the dashed line. It happens when and you'll see that some of the differences are small. The combined gender norms are more accurate in 100% of the cases. And you can see, again, parents, teachers, it doesn't matter. So if we look at these diagnostic accuracy curves, even though the differences are, particularly at the ends, those kids who are particularly normal or extremely, there's a little difference, but I don't worry about those kids. We'll get those right, what we do. That's where the differences are greatest. That's where the combined gender norms really are far than gender norms. So the accuracy data tells us that combined gender norms preserve known and documented differences on key behavioral and emotional constructs like anxiety and hyperactivity. Combined gender norms accepted difference in prevalence rates of disorders known to differ as a function of gender. Gender norms are more accurate in the diagnostic process, with the exception of the really extreme cases. The choice of norms become irrelevant, and it's not those cases that worry cause, and that's where the combined gender norms really shine. Differential diagnosis then is best done using combined gender norms, and it's critical to success. We need to differentiate among disorders if we're going right treatment. Child and adolescent emotional and behavioral disorders should never be one size fits all. Just because you're emotionally disturbed doesn't mean you should get the same treatment as everyone else. The evidence
Dr. Reynolds, we're having some technical issues. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm wondering if we can have you try to turn off your camera and see if that improves the internet connection. Everyone, if you can hear me, we are trying to resolve the audio issues. Dr. Reynolds, we cannot hear you if you can hear me. Again, we are having some connection issues with Dr. Reynolds right now. We are asking if he can try to reconnect and see if it resolves the audio issues that we're experiencing. Thank you all for your patience as we try to work this out.
Okay, I understand that we were lost there for a while, and they asked me to log off and log back in, and my screen shows that my microphone is active, and there's no way for me to tell if you guys can hear me or not. So give me a moment to see if I can get a message.
Dr. Reynolds, we can hear you again. This is much better.
Okay. Okay, great. I have no idea what happened, but.
Yes, we did have a suggestion to start back at the point of combined versus homogeneous norm use. It seems like that's where it cut out for most people.
About here. Is this about where I should start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. The wonders of the web. So combined or same-sex norms. Combined gender norms preserve known and documented differences in key behavioral and emotional constructs like anxiety and hyperactivity, where we know that there are gender differences and they should be preserved. This will preserve accepted differences in prevalence rates of diagnosis. Combined gender norms are more accurate overall in the diagnostic process, with the exception of really extreme cases where it doesn't matter what norms you use, you'll get it right. But where we're so concerned, it's the more difficult cases, and that's where combined gender norms are even the most accurate. The treatment of child and adolescent emotional and behavioral disorders should never be one size fits all. Strongly in favor of matching treatments to specific diagnoses if we're to be effective in treatment. Students with emotional behavior treatment, not just management. A declaration of eligibility is just not enough. One doesn't work. We don't want to become McDonald's. We have to match treatment to diagnosis if we want to get it right. Once we know what the problem is and know specifically the origin, we can be more effective in treating it. The BASC-3 provides the guidance and the BASC-3 materials, the wherewithal to make accurate diagnoses of ADHD. It gives us comprehensive information, and it includes history and context. We should never interpret test data blindly. Remember that you would certainly interpret this Rorschach response differently if you knew it came from a flying insect. Sorry, but bugs and Rorschachs just go together. I think so. You probably saw that slide. Remember, history and context are critical. Even though with ADHD, we're evaluating brain behavior relationships, we have to interpret it in the context of the history and the day-to-day life of the individual. To you, this may look like dinner, but to a chicken, it's a horror movie. Remember, know who you're evaluating. Do not diagnose raccoons with insomnia because they stay up all night. We see examples that are abundant in the DSM. Here are 13 symptoms that are common to 3 different disorders. If you saw a 9-year-old boy with all 13 of these symptoms, what's your diagnosis? Well, it turns out they fit the diagnostic criteria for 3 different disorders perfectly on the basis of symptom presentation. But these 3 disorders, excuse me, have different histories. So I really have to emphasize that history taking is critical if we're going to interpret our test data correctly. On the BASC-3 reports, you'll find diagnostic considerations specific to ADHD, and you'll see that those match up on the report. And by the way, this requires a license from the American Psychiatric Association to use the DSM material, which Pearson has obtained. You can't just put DSM material into your formats. So you'll see that we match that up, and note whenever there are things there that match up to ADHD specifically. We also have clinical probability indexes on BASC-3 that include ADHD. The ADHD probability index and the functional impairment index are the most critical in diagnosing ADHD. And these are actuarially derived indexes designed to help you get to the right diagnosis. The ADHD probability index on the BASC-3 denotes children with elevated scores who experience problems that adversely affect their academic performance, such as difficulty focusing or maintaining attention, inability to organize tasks effectively, difficulty making decisions, or difficulty moderating their own activity level. So these key around the central features of ADHD. And these were derived actuarially by comparing every item on BASC-3 for normals and, for an ADHD sample and a demographically matched, very large sample of ADHD children. The functional impairment index is devoted to meeting the criteria of whether or not a child suffers from actual functional impairment in their daily life. It indicates the level of the level of difficulty a child has engaging in successful or appropriate behavior across a variety of interactions. It's the second highest clinical index in ADHD diagnoses behind the ADHD index. So children with ADHD on the actuarial scales will have their highest score on the ADHD index, and their next highest is typically on functional impairment. We have executive functioning indexes that are new to the BASC-3, and ADHD kids perform very poorly on these. Those include the problem solving, attentional control, behavioral control, and emotional control indexes. These are some of the worst scores of children with ADHD. You do get an overall score on this, and it's their worst score on all the content scales. So let's look very quickly, and because of that glitch, we really are pressed for time. So I think you will want to go back and look at what I'm about to show you later on the handout, because you're certainly not going to have time to learn it right now. But we have clear ADHD profiles on the teacher rating scale, for example. Their highest score on the composites is school problems, and their lowest score is adaptive behavior. On the clinical scales, we see their highest scores, thank goodness, were on attention problems, hyperactivity, and learning problems. Their lowest score was on somatization. On the adaptive scales, they had no scores above 50. They were impaired across the board, but their lowest scores were in study skills and leadership. On the content scales, executive functioning was their worst score, followed closely by emotional self-control. If we look at the PRS, we see very, very similar findings. There's not a school problems composite on the PRS, but their highest score is on externalizing problems, lowest is on the adaptive skills. On the clinical scales, their highest scores were on attention and hyperactivity, as you saw with the TRS, and aggression and conduct problems, and they were all higher than even their TRS scores. Their lowest score was on somatization, same as the TRS. And on the adaptive scales, they did even worse on the parent ratings. They had no scores above T of 45. Their lowest scores were on ADLs, which the teachers don't rate, and leadership, which was one of the two lowest scales rated by teachers. On the content scales, again, executive functioning, but now anger control with their parents presents as a serious problem. And their lowest score, unfortunately, was on resiliency. On the parenting relationship questionnaire, by the way, the ADHD sample scores very low on attachment and involvement and very high on relational frustration. This is very different than other clinical groups. The ADHD group has its own pattern on the parenting relationship questionnaire. Well, what are effective for interventions for ADHD? Now that we know how to get the diagnosis right and apply our profiles from the BASC-3. Effective interventions for ADHD include medication. There are multiple medications, primarily stimulants, that work best. Psychosocial interventions also are effective. Behavioral and cognitive behavioral interventions are by far the most effective, but have to target specific behaviors. Educational interventions are effective as well, particularly if you use a direct instruction model to teach learning and study skills, teach strategic listening, teach time management, and teach organizational techniques. The best intervention, though, is all of the above. You should make an emphatic choice to adopt multiple interventions. When you are dealing with ADHD, medication alone should never be the intervention plan. It must be accompanied by psychosocial and educational interventions if it's going to be effective. Some things that don't work with ADHD, the Feingold diet. It's effective in less than 5% of cases, and some of my specialty ADHD colleagues would even chide me for saying that. They'll tell me it's less than 3%. Food and vitamin supplements don't work, with the exception of omega-3 fatty acids from fish or krill as opposed to flax. These have mild beneficial effects in high doses, but are widely held to be safe. Perceptual motor programs like exercise programs, movement therapy, sensory integrative therapy have no science to say they work. Punishment paradigms with ADHD are extremely bad ideas. They are very resistant to punishment as a means of modifying behavior, except in the immediate presence of the punisher. And there is no evidence that punishment generalizes. Some good sources for psychosocial and educational interventions, and you'll notice my name on these, and of course, mine are my favorite. It'd be unusual if they weren't, because I wrote and developed these. The Energetic Brain, our book on ADHD, which is available, actually cheaper on Amazon than it is Wiley & Sons. The BASC-3 Behavior Intervention Guide from Pearson, and our book, Strategies for Academic Success, which is an instructional handbook for teaching students how to study, learn, and take tests. And it handles a lot of the educational interventions. The Behavior Intervention Guide deals with the behavioral intervention components. It's a comprehensive text and software guide to detailed specific interventions. For example, here are the categories around which we've organized a variety of evidence-based interventions that work in the schools. For most ADHD cases, you want to target attention and hyperactivity at a minimum. And other domains can be targeted based on the child. If you went to the attention chapter of the Behavior Intervention Guide, you would find all of these headings. Only the annotated bibliography it's only available in the electronic edition. I'm trying to talk too fast now because we got behind. But we have very detailed step-by-step plans for implementation. Once you select an intervention, and all of these are documented to be effective with the designated population and have evidence-based research that demonstrates they work in schools. But there are multiple interventions, and you need to choose the one that's going to work best in your setting. Here's a list, for example, of all the interventions that are known to be effective for ameliorating attention problems. And we have very detailed presentations on these in the behavior intervention section. So under attention for self-management, for example, here are some examples of the level of detail and things that you need to know, the basics, how to put this into place, how to implement it, how to prepare in advance, and all the stages of implementation, as well as examples of consideration for implementing these, both for teaching and adapting them to the age and developmental level of the child. All of this is dealt with in detail in the Behavior Intervention Guide. We provide similar levels of detail for dealing with hyperactivity. So remember that ADHD is a disorder of self-regulation and often shows EF deficits. But you'll notice that I don't recommend EF coaching because I don't think we can teach executive functioning. The generalizability problem is always with us. Instead of trying to ameliorate executive function, the solution is to train the specific needed skills and enhance the knowledge base of the brain. Find out the exact EF skill that is deficient and teach that specific skill. EF coaching doesn't work. The three keys to understanding what to train is that the brain is an interdependent systemic network, and that higher cognitive processes are subject to the principle of dynamic localization of function. And brain training via process training doesn't work because it doesn't generalize. Train specific skills. As an example, if Johnny can't organize his study materials or figure out what to study in what sequence, that's not necessarily an EF problem to be solved. It may be an EF problem, but coaching EF won't work with that. So what do? Train his sequencing skills? Hire an EF coach? No. Teach Johnny to study. Studying is a skill that can be taught directly. So direct your interventions at the underlying skills. Teach Johnny study skills using a model of direct instruction. So we can teach Johnny to do all of these things. And these are covered in our Strategies for Academic Success Intervention Manual. The same thing with listening problems. We can treat this as a general EF problem and coach EF and it'll fail, or we can teach the specific skills in which Louisa has deficiency. And we can do those using direct instruction models. So remember, remediating skill deficiencies also requires matching the intervention to the child. Target skill problems and not process. Attack the skill deficiency. And I'm going to skip ahead a little now because I think I've hit that. And be sure you involve parents. So we have parenting tip sheets, and a number of these now, while people are in COVID lockdown, Pearson has made available for free on the website, and you can download these and provide them to parents. I'm not sure how much longer that's going to last. You eventually may have to go back to purchasing them, but these are very good for developing partnerships with parents and giving them information about what to do. And they contain a great deal of information in all areas of concern where you're trying to work with parents and work with children to improve behavior. I mentioned educational interventions. This is our educational intervention manual. I'm going to skip over all of this, but you can look at this when you get the PDF handout and learn more about this. This is where you can have scripted lessons and programs for teaching things, for example, like study skills, teaching listening skills, intervening with all of those things and overcoming academic liabilities. And all of these are presented in a direct instruction model. We also know that we have to monitor intervention effects if we're going to be successful. And we should monitor quantitatively, not qualitatively, and do it on a regular schedule. We developed the BASC-3 Flex Monitor as part of the total package to allow you to do that. I'm going to have to skip through this now too because we got behind, but what I'm going to tell you is that there is a recorded webinar that runs about 45 minutes specifically on using the BASC-3 Flex Monitor, both for screening and monitoring behavior change, that's available for free on the Pearson website. You can locate this through the BASC-3 product page and go through that presentation. And I think you will find it interesting because the BASC-3 Flex Monitor allows you to develop your own test forms uniquely tailored to individual cases and uniquely tailored to your setting. We let you be the test developer, and then we do the psychometrics behind the scenes immediately. We compute the reliability, we use all validated items that you choose, and then we norm it in the background. So that's how that works. You also have to monitor treatment fidelity, and we have treatment fidelity checklists that you can use as well. So I'm going to stop there. I'm showing we have about 5 minutes left, and see if there are maybe one or two questions that were very popular that people were asking. And I think Aaron, you were going to kind of collate those, and maybe I can deal with one or two before we have to stop.
Sure. Why do behavior charts often fail with children with ADHD?
And by behavior charts, that's a very generic term. There are some things that are successful that might be considered that. And for example, daily report cards are something that are helpful. For example, with kids with certain symptoms of ADHD. But behavior charting relies a lot on self-reinforcement and self-regulation. And unless we have taught those kids self-regulation and given them the specific skills to be able to self-regulate, which requires specific interventions, and those are in the BASC-3 Behavior Intervention Guide, then the behavior charting is not going to be nearly as effective, particularly if they also have significant issues with attention. Just having a behavior chart for them to give them feedback is just not enough.
Great, thank you. Another question came from a school psychologist that said that they use the combined norms to answer the question of, does the student's emotional and behavioral regulation in the classroom differ significantly from norms? Then uses the ADHD norms to answer the question, is this student's rating profile similar to other students diagnosed with ADHD? Is that reasonable?
That is reasonable, but remember, if you use the ADHD norms, they shouldn't be even elevating on ADHD. They should be scoring around a T of 50 on hyperactivity and attention compared to other children with ADHD. And what you can get a good look at, and the way that I use it for that, is to see, for example, are there comorbidities in which they are excessive? For example, how does their level of depression compare to other kids diagnosed as ADHD? Do they have more anxiety than most kids diagnosed with ADHD? So I find that comparison more useful. But you certainly can use it to look at the match between profiles. Just don't expect elevations on symptoms of hyperactivity when you compare a hyperactive child to another group of hyperactive children. Because you say, well, on the ADHD norms, he had a T-score of 50 on hyperactivity. Well, that means he's about averagely hyperactive within a group of kids known to be diagnosed as hyperactive. So just be careful not to make that mistake.
Great. I think we have time for one more. We've had a couple of questions about when an IQ test is necessary. Can you elaborate on that a little bit in the diagnosis of ADHD?
Well, I'm going to use a word that I rarely use, and that word is always. That gives you a much better understanding of the child's cognitive level of development. And now the DSM has formalized what many of us argued for over 20 years. You must consider the child's developmental level and the behavioral level, the level of self-regulation, the level of behavioral control and attention that would be expected from a 9-year-old with an IQ of 120 is very different than that of a 9-year-old with an IQ of 65. So it's part of understanding the context of the person's life and the context of their behavior. And intellectual level is a key part of the context of your life. And while I really don't like always and never, in this kind of diagnostic context, I always assess cognitive level.
Great. Thank you so much. I know we are out of time for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Reynolds, for sharing all this information with us. This was very helpful. We've gotten a few more questions that we weren't able to get to today, and we will attempt to follow up with everyone. And thank you, everyone, for your patience as we work to resolve the audio issues that we experienced today. Thank you all for your time, and thank you, Dr. Reynolds, for all this great information.
Thank you.